In this lesson, we're going to deal with another core drafting strategy, and that is the strategy associated with audience. We've looked at purpose, and we've seen that you need to have an underlying purpose of any written work that you're going to produce, but in particular in writing, and we took a long look at the example of a letter of advice to a client. Now, the next thing you need to consider is who is your audience. And that is not simply a matter of identifying them so that you can put them in the salutation, "Dear Mr. Smith." This is a matter of identifying who you're writing to and what are their characteristics. Later on in our other core strategies, we're going to talk about tone, and identifying your audience is a very important aspect when it comes to determining the correct tone. So, what do I mean then by identifying your audience? You obviously want to know who it is, if that's even possible. Sometimes you don't. If you're writing a submission for court, you might not know who the judge is going to be. If you're writing a contract for a party, you might not know much about the other party at all. But you do know about your client. So again, like with purpose, audience might have more than one answer. Let's say we're drafting a letter of demand. We act for Mrs. Jones. We are instructed that you owe Mrs. Jones $1 billion. Pay up immediately, you scumbag jerk. Yours faithfully, name of law firm goes here. So, who is the audience for that letter? Obviously, the audience is the scumbag jerk. That's answer 1. That's very obvious. However, why did we use the phrase scumbag jerk? Firstly, you shouldn't use that phrase. That was a joke. So don't go writing letters with scumbag jerk in them and say, Chris told me to do it. But more importantly, we've never met this person, probably. We don't know what they're like. We don't know anything about them. So why would we possibly have taken Mrs. Jones's instructions and inserted the word scumbag jerk in there? It's because there's a second audience to this letter, and that's Mrs. Jones herself. Mrs. Jones wants to see that the tone of the letter we're using is appropriate to allow her to feel like her emotional need for vengeance, let's call it that, is being met by calling the scumbag jerk instead of just not mentioning anything at all. The letter could quite easily have been written, "We're instructed to demand you pay $1 million within 7 days, yours faithfully." It might say, or our client will sue you, or something like that. But the scumbag jerk element was because whoever wrote that letter and decided to breach their legal ethics by engaging in overly emotive language to a third party was Mrs. Jones is going to read the letter. And you see a lot of letters like this, and sometimes people go too far. And I've told you you need to find balance in purpose. You also need to find balance in audience. In particular, in emotionally charged situations where your clients might be particularly upset or angry or reactive or responsive, or perhaps that's just their personal nature, notwithstanding that the matter might be a commercial one. But if your client is skewing your language in a particular way, then you need to be a bit careful. What you need to be able to find is that delicate balance between your client understanding that you are doing your job effectively and professionally, and them feeling like that you are making hard-hitting points and that you are being, in a sense, their voice or their agent, not just in a legal sense, but also in a personal sense. So there is a delicate balance to be found there, and it can be quite hard to find. If in doubt, my personal view is that you should err on the side of professionalism and err on the side of writing the way you think you ought to write as a lawyer. There are a number of reasons for that, both ethical and practical, but the principal reason is this. If you go too far in one direction because your client's angry, then you can't predict the reaction from the other side. It might go incredibly badly. Whereas if you stay professional, then at the very least you can't be pinned with having miscommunicated your client's intentions. Whereas if you write professionally, you can get on the phone to your client and say, look, I know you wanted to put this in. I don't think we should do that, I think it's likely to create more problems than it solves. I've drafted the letter in this way. I have made the points you wanted to make, but I've kept it using this language because I think, coming from a law firm, that that's going to be more effective and more useful for you in the long run than if we said the kinds of things you asked me to say in your email the other day. Now, that can be a difficult conversation, and a lot of lawyers simply don't. Some lawyers simply shoot from the hip themselves. Their client might be mild-mannered and even-tempered, but the lawyer is a firebrand waiting to happen and writes a lot of really silly, emotional correspondence. But I'm not saying it's improper to have any sort of emotion in your correspondence. Certainly communicate your client's feelings, but don't necessarily engage in language that's unprofessional. It's borderline unethical, and you really need to think about how that's going to impact upon the bigger picture. The best catalyst, if you're not sure how this is going, if you've not got that fine balance yet as second nature, the best catalyst is this. Picture you sitting in court because you have been sued for something, and the judge reading out loud in court that letter that you have written. What is the judge going to say about it? And that, I find, is a good litmus test. If you are prepared for your correspondence to be read out loud in front of a whole bunch of people or colleagues or judges or legal dignitaries or whatever, then you've probably gone too far in one direction than the other. Now, there is a place for emotion in persuasion, and there is a place for emotion in legal drafting. But in considering your audience, you need to consider primary audience and then the dual purpose. To the extent possible, those two things should align and you should achieve both goals. But you need to consider your audience from that perspective. Now, next, you need to consider the sophistication of your audience. And this goes across the board. If you are communicating with a judge who has only just been appointed to the bench and their entire practice has been in criminal law, but you are going up there for something to do with bankruptcy, then you need to consider in your communication how you go about explaining things. Whereas if you are going up on a tax matter to see the tax judge who has been doing tax law for 60 years, there are certain underlying assumptions that you're going to make about the starting point of knowledge of that particular judge. And so it works that way too. You need to consider the sophistication of your client. You need to consider the sophistication of the other party. If you're dealing with a self-represented litigant, you need to take that into account. If you're dealing with a lawyer, you need to take that into account too. I'm not saying you should be patronizing, because that can sometimes tend to happen in legal letters. We end up patronizing. Your client, just because they are not legally sophisticated, is not necessarily stupid. You don't need to talk down to them, but you might just need to avoid using jargon. You might need to avoid using particular phrases without explaining them. But if you're explaining something every sentence, perhaps it's a better opportunity for a meeting rather than a letter, because you might find that your letter comes across as patronizing. And that's not exactly something that's going to be good for your relationship with your client. So consider the sophistication of your client. The next thing you want to consider is the experience of the person you're writing to. And I touched on this before about sophistication, but I'm getting here at points of connection that you can make. If you're communicating with someone that you know is an experienced business person, then you can start to communicate in ways that they're going to be used to and comfortable with, and that they will understand better and that they will respond to better. Similarly, if you're communicating with other parties and you know they have experience in particular areas, then you can use that as a sounding board, as a touch point in your level of communication. So understanding a little bit about who you're communicating to is going to be really useful. But so far as audience is concerned, what I really encourage you to do, much as I did with the purpose lesson, is to sit back and go, who is this letter really for? Who is it also for? And then you've got your primary audience and you've got your secondary audiences sorted. And to the extent possible, you will be using language and tone and structure and complexity that is aligned to resonate as best as possible with that particular audience. That's the end of this lesson, and we'll move on to the next core component in the next one.